Maureen O'Hara was never the kind of woman Hollywood could easily control. Long before actresses were praised for speaking out, she was already doing something far more dangerous in the golden age of film. She was refusing to be intimidated, refusing to be humiliated, and eventually refusing to work with one powerful man ever again. To the public, Maureen O'Hara looked like the perfect Hollywood legend. She was glamorous, fearless, and unforgettable on screen. With her striking beauty, fiery red hair, and commanding presence, she became one of the most respected actresses of her era. Audiences admired her strength. Directors admired her talent. Studios admired the box office value she brought to every role. But behind the camera, the story was far more complicated. Hollywood in those days was built on silence. Powerful men made the rules, and actresses were expected to smile, obey, and never complain. If a male director shouted, he was called brilliant. If a woman objected, she was called difficult. That was the system, and Maureen O'Hara knew exactly how cruel that system could be. What made her different was that she had a limit. Over the years, rumors and later accounts painted a troubling picture of one of the most famous working relationships in her career. On the surface, it looked like a legendary collaboration. But beneath that success, there were signs of tension, control, and deep personal resentment. The man at the center of it all was not just powerful. He was feared. Many respected him. Many praised his genius. But some also knew how harsh and humiliating he could be behind the scenes. And Maureen never forgot it. She was not the kind of actress who would simply accept bad treatment because it came from a famous name. She had pride, discipline, and a strong sense of self. The more pressure she faced, the more firmly she stood her ground. That made her rare in old Hollywood. It also made her dangerous to anyone who thought she would stay silent forever. So, when Maureen O'Hara finally refused to work with him again, it was not a random decision. It was not a passing disagreement. It was the result of something deeper, something painful, and something that had clearly pushed her too far. The real question is this: what exactly happened behind the scenes that made one of Hollywood's strongest women decide she had finally had enough? For years, the public saw only the polished version of Maureen O'Hara's career. They saw the elegance, the prestige, the classic films that made her unforgettable. What they did not see was the pressure that came with working alongside men whose power in Hollywood made them almost untouchable. And that is where this story begins to shift. Because the man Maureen reportedly refused to work with again was not just another actor or director. He was a giant in the industry, someone whose name carried enormous weight, someone many people were too afraid to challenge even when his behavior crossed the line. To outsiders, working with him looked like an honor. Behind closed doors, it could feel very different. Maureen O'Hara was known for her strength, but even strong people reach a point where respect matters more than opportunity. That is what makes her decisions so revealing. This was not the reaction of a fragile star who could not handle criticism. Maureen had built her career in one of the toughest systems imaginable. She understood discipline. She understood pressure. She understood that filmmaking was not supposed to be easy. But there is a difference between demanding excellence and creating an atmosphere of humiliation. There is a difference between intensity and cruelty. And according to the stories that followed her for years, she knew that difference very well. The more people later reflected on old Hollywood, the more a darker truth started coming into focus. Some of the industry's most celebrated men were protected for behavior that would never be accepted if the full reality had been exposed in real time. Their talent became a shield. Their reputations became armor. And everyone around them was expected to endure it in silence. But Maureen was not built for silence. She was proud of her work, proud of her heritage, and proud of the standards she held for herself. That pride may have been exactly why certain men found her difficult. Not because she was unreasonable, but because she would not surrender her dignity just to make them comfortable. That is often how powerful people describe those who resist them. Difficult, emotional, uncooperative. But sometimes those labels hide a much simpler truth. Sometimes the so-called difficult person is simply the one who sees clearly what everyone else is too afraid to say. And in Maureen O'Hara's case, that clarity may have cost her peace, but it also gave her something far more important, a line she would no longer allow anyone to cross. What makes Maureen O'Hara's story so powerful is that she did not need to hold a dramatic press conference to make her point. She did not need to name every wound in public. In old Hollywood, even a quiet refusal could speak louder than a scandal ever could. And that silence may be exactly why her decision still feels so haunting today. Because when a woman like Maureen O'Hara reached the point of saying no more, it usually meant the damage had been building for a long time. This was a woman who had survived the brutal machinery of the studio era. She had worked in an industry that rewarded charm in public and obedience in private. She knew how to stay composed. She knew how to protect her image. She knew that one wrong move could be used against her for years. So, if she chose to distance herself from someone powerful, it was unlikely to be over something small. It suggests a deeper betrayal. Not necessarily betrayal in the romantic sense, but in the professional and human sense. The kind that happens when admiration turns into disappointment, when respect is replaced by fear, when someone you are expected to trust reveals a side of themselves that you cannot unsee. That is often what ends great Hollywood partnerships. Not one explosive moment, but the slow realization that working together is no longer worth the emotional cost. For Maureen, that emotional cost may have been enormous. She had an image of strength, but strength does not mean a person feels nothing. In fact, people with the strongest exteriors are often the ones carrying the most unseen frustration. They stay calm longer. They endure more. They give second chances others would never give. But once they finally shut the door, they rarely open it again. That seems to fit Maureen O'Hara perfectly. She was known for her discipline, her intelligence, and her unwillingness to be treated as less than an equal. She was not reckless. She was not impulsive. She was measured, which makes her reported refusal feel even more meaningful. It was not chaos. It was judgment. A final judgment. And perhaps that is what unsettles people most about this story. The idea that one of classic Hollywood's most admired working relationships may have been hiding bitterness, humiliation, and a breaking point the public never fully understood. Because once you see that possibility, the old movies begin to look different. The chemistry is still there, the magic is still there, but now there is also tension underneath it. A feeling that what audiences celebrated may have come at a private cost. And Maureen O'Hara, in the end, may have decided that no role, no director, and no legend was worth paying that price again. And perhaps that was the most shocking part of all. Maureen O'Hara did not behave like someone desperate to cling to Hollywood at any cost. She behaved like a woman who understood her own worth, even in an industry built to make women doubt it. That alone set her apart. Because old Hollywood thrived on imbalance. Directors were treated like kings. Male stars were forgiven for almost everything. But actresses lived under a different set of rules. They had to be beautiful, agreeable, and endlessly accommodating. The moment they showed anger or resistance, they risked being labeled difficult, unstable, or impossible to manage. Maureen O'Hara never fit comfortably inside that system. She had too much spirit, too much self-respect, and too much inner steel to play the role of the obedient star forever. That may be why her story continues to resonate now, decades later, not just because of who she was, but because of what she represented. A woman who could recognize power, endure it for a time, and still decide that enough was enough. And that decision likely did not come without consequences. In Hollywood, refusing to work with the wrong person could quietly change everything. Projects disappeared, calls stopped coming, opportunities shifted elsewhere. There did not need to be an official punishment. The system knew how to freeze people out without ever admitting what it was doing. That was part of its power. So, if Maureen drew a line, she knew the risk, which makes her refusal even more extraordinary. She was not just rejecting a man, she was rejecting the fear attached to him, the myth around him. The unspoken rule that everyone else was expected to tolerate what he did because of his status, talent, or influence. She was, in her own way, exposing the lie at the center of old Hollywood. The lie that genius excuses cruelty. The lie that success makes bad behavior acceptable. The lie that women should simply endure and move on. Maureen O'Hara did not accept that lie. And maybe that is why her silence carried so much weight. She did not need to explain every detail for people to sense what had happened. Sometimes the strongest statement is not a public accusation. Sometimes it is the decision to walk away and never look back. That kind of refusal leaves a mark. Because when someone is strong, composed, and professional as Maureen O'Hara finally cuts ties, it tells you the truth was probably worse than anyone wanted to admit. And in the next part, that truth gets even closer to the surface. Because the more we look at the men who shaped her career, the more we begin to understand why one of Hollywood's fiercest women may have chosen dignity over legend in the end. What makes this story even more unsettling is that Maureen O'Hara was not someone who frightened easily. She had spent years around larger-than-life personalities, forceful directors, and an industry that fed on hierarchy. She understood ego. She understood pressure. She understood that Hollywood often confused intimidation with greatness, but understanding it did not mean accepting it forever. That is where Maureen became different from so many others around her. She may have worked within the system, but she never fully belonged to it in spirit. There was always something in her that resisted being reduced to just another studio creation. She was too sharp for that, too proud, too aware. And perhaps that awareness is what made the final break inevitable. Because once you truly see someone for who they are, it becomes impossible to go back to the illusion. The public may continue celebrating the legend, the studio may continue protecting the myth, the industry may keep calling the man brilliant, complicated, difficult but necessary. But for the person who experienced the damage up close, the magic is gone. All that remains is memory. And memory can be far more powerful than gossip. By the time Maureen O'Hara reportedly decided she would not work with him again, it likely was not about a single outburst anymore. It was about a pattern of disrespect, a pattern of control, a pattern that had finally erased any remaining benefit of loyalty. That is how these stories usually end, not with one dramatic moment, but with the slow collapse of patience. For someone like Maureen, patience must have run deep. She was known for grace under pressure, for professionalism, for carrying herself with strength even when others around her were unraveling. But grace should never be mistaken for weakness. In fact, the people who appear calmest are often the ones who have been measuring the situation the longest, watching, enduring, deciding exactly when the line has been crossed for the last time. And when that moment came, Maureen did what many in Hollywood never dared to do. She chose herself. She chose her dignity over access, her self-respect over approval, her peace over the prestige of standing next to another powerful man whose reputation demanded silence from everyone around him. That choice says everything. Because in an era when actresses were expected to tolerate humiliation as part of the job, Maureen O'Hara's refusal became something much larger than a private decision. It became a quiet act of defiance. And that is why her story still lingers. Not because she created scandal, but because she did something even more threatening to Hollywood's old power structure. She stopped pretending. And that may be the most revealing truth of all. In Hollywood, people often survived by pretending. Pretending the set was happy. Pretending the director was merely demanding. Pretending the actress was fine. Pretending the tension was just artistic passion, pretending the damage was worth it because the film would be remembered forever. Maureen O'Hara eventually stopped playing along with that performance. That is what gives her story its lasting power. She was part of the machine, but she never surrendered completely to it. She gave audiences unforgettable performances, carried herself like a star, and helped create some of the most celebrated films of her time. But behind that elegance was a woman who could see the cost of that world with painful clarity. And once she saw it clearly enough, she could not unsee it. That is the thing about betrayal in Hollywood. It does not always arrive as one dramatic scandal. Sometimes it arrives through repetition, through the same insults, the same fear, The same feeling that your talent is being used while your dignity is being quietly stripped away. Little by little, the admiration dies. Little by little, the loyalty weakens. Until one day, all that remains is a cold certainty that you will never put yourself through it again. That kind of certainty feels final. For Maureen O'Hara, refusing to work with him again was not just a career choice. It was a statement about self-worth, a declaration that no amount of fame, prestige, or cinematic history was enough to justify crossing certain lines. In an industry that treated women as replaceable, that kind of boundary was radical. Because boundaries frighten powerful people. They can tolerate silence. They can tolerate suffering. They can even tolerate quiet resentment, as long as the work continues. But the moment someone says no more, the balance shifts. The illusion breaks. The person they thought they controlled becomes impossible to manage. And sometimes, that is the moment the truth finally begins to surface. Maureen's truth may never have been told in one single explosive confession. It did not need to be. Her distance, her refusal, and the emotional shadow left behind already say enough. They suggest a woman who reached the edge of what she was willing to endure and stepped back before losing herself completely. That is not weakness. That is survival. And in the next part, the silence around this story grows even more haunting, because the more we look at the hidden culture of classic Hollywood, the more Maureen O'Hara's refusal begins to feel less like an isolated choice and more like a warning about what really happened behind the golden curtain. The more this story unfolds, the clearer it becomes that Maureen O'Hara's refusal was never just about one man. It was about an entire culture that protected men like him. Classic Hollywood sold the world a dream. Glamour, romance, elegance, prestige. But behind that shining image was a system built on fear, control, and silence. Directors could explode. Producers could manipulate. Male stars could dominate a set. And as long as the film succeeded, almost anything could be excused. That was the unspoken bargain. The audience got the magic. The industry kept the secrets. And women like Maureen O'Hara were expected to endure both. That is why her story still feels so relevant. She was not simply navigating personalities. She was navigating a power structure designed to make resistance costly. Every actress in that era understood the rules, even if no one said them out loud. Be beautiful, be professional, be agreeable, and above all, never make trouble for powerful men. But Maureen had something Hollywood could never fully erase. She had pride. Not vanity, not ego, pride in the deepest sense. Pride in who she was, in the work she gave, and in the respect she believed every human being deserved. That kind of pride can survive pressure for a long time, but once it is wounded too many times, it hardens into something else. Into distance, into clarity, into refusal. And that refusal is what makes her story so haunting. Because it suggests that somewhere behind the famous films, the applause, and the carefully preserved legends, there was a private truth too painful to keep denying. A truth that made Maureen look at a once powerful connection and decide it no longer deserved her loyalty. That is not something actresses of that era were encouraged to do. They were encouraged to forgive, to adapt, to stay useful, to pretend the humiliation was part of the process, to let the man remain a genius, no matter what damage he left behind him. But Maureen O'Hara seems to have understood something many people only admit much later in life. Talent is not innocence. Success is not character. And fame does not transform cruelty into something noble. That may be the real reason her refusal still echoes across generations. It was not loud, but it was devastating. It exposed the limits of Hollywood's illusion. It showed that even the most celebrated partnerships could be poisoned beneath the surface. And it reminded the world that sometimes the strongest thing a woman can do is walk away from someone everyone else still calls legendary.